Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. My guest today is Dan Mahala. Dan is a retired educator, avid traveler, former marathon runner, and passionate reader. In today's program, I'll focus on the last dimension I just mentioned, passionate reader. Dan, I know that for years you've been a very avid reader. What kinds of books do you like to read?
Well, today I like to read everything in the humanities, just about. I started out mainly reading history. I was always fascinated by historical, even novels and historical nonfiction, the wars, the kings, and all of those things. And as I learned more about history, I found that you really can't understand a period of history without getting into the literature of the period, the philosophers of the period, and so forth. So I've since then taken on reading a lot more literature and philosophy in conjunction with the history I read.
Yeah. I know you have a graduate degree in history.
Yeah. That's where my interest started. But now I'd say I'm probably more interested in literature than I am in history.
Yeah.
As far as my reading goes. Yeah.
What's interesting about that is that some famous commentators have said that we might actually learn more about ourselves from novels than from history.
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky put it this way. Noam Chomsky said, we will probably always learn more about ourselves from novels than from science.
Yeah, there's no question about it. Reading is reading good literature. If you pick and choose properly, you'll get to know a lot more about yourself and mankind through good literature than any other method, I think.
Do you have any favorite books, favorite authors?
I got a lot of them. I think if I had to pick out a short list, I'd certainly include Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, but I'd also go back to Homer, some of the playwrights during the Greek time, Sophocles, one of my favorites, some of the 19th century authors, Stendhal, Victor Hugo, and there's a lot in between, but I think they've all been recognized by society, by the world, and the fact that they're still taught. Most of these people are still taught in schools today that they have something to say.
If you were to explain to some young people, high school students, college students, why reading Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Stendhal is valuable, what would you say? What's the point?
Well, I'd start off probably by taking Plato's advice, know thyself. And this is the most difficult thing that we have to achieve in our life. And really our lives are too short to completely achieve this. And I would have to say, in order to know thyself, you must know something about mankind. You must know something about human nature. And the best way you can achieve this is through the great minds, the great playwrights, the great authors who have taken individual cases and generalize them to a degree that you can learn something about mankind through careful reading of the great authors.
It's interesting that you alluded to the Greek maxim, know thyself.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that when one reads the great writers, the primary illumination one gets from reading the great writers is you begin to understand yourself a little better and to think more about your own behavior and what one might do to live a more fulfilling life. If you never had developed the habit of reading, how do you think your life might have turned out differently?
Well, it certainly would have been a lot different. I don't see, how people can understand themselves, human nature, society, history, or anything without a careful study of what is human nature, why do I behave the way I do, and all of these things. And I think outside of experience, yeah, we learn from experience. We learn from death in a family, from suffering, from wars, from religion. All of these experiences are good teachers. But we can never put them together, I don't think, and reflect on them and contemplate on them unless we see the images produced by the great authors, and the great playwrights and great authors. And, if it wasn't for this, I think I would more or less fall into the same traps that everybody else does. We're all tempted by the entertainment that's available to us. Television, naturally. Now the internet provides all kind of different avenues of entertainment, movies, and all of these things. And if we rely on that for our information, we're not going to get the best information, number one, and we're not going to have time to digest the good information. We all handle information at a different pace. And reading allows you to reread. When you're kind of shocked by reading a new revelation that maybe you thought no one else experienced but you can reread it and reflect on it and so forth. You can't in a movie and other experiences. So I think if it wasn't for reading, I would not understand myself, human nature, and I'd fall into the same traps that other people do in, these defense mechanisms that we use to escape reality.
Yeah, I agree with that. For me, one of the great values of reading the great books has been they help guide my life. They help me to direct my life. They provoke me to think more deeply. And you alluded to the entertainment industry before. I think one of the sad aspects of our culture, and maybe of all advanced cultures where the entertainment industry has a pervasive influence, is that usually, in my opinion, the entertainment industry is a poor guide to living a better life. That life is difficult. We start with that premise. But I think that if one adopts the values, so many of the values that either directly or indirectly are promoted by the advertising industry, that will make life even more frustrating.
Oh, sure.
Whereas if one reads Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare, Stendhal, Thoreau, Emerson, they provide illumination, whereas the entertainment industry, I think, confuses us more than anything else. One of the things I did was to do a little research on what some of the great writers have said, or some of the great people in history, not all writers, have said about reading and studying and what its value is. And one of the more interesting things I came across, and I came across this years ago, Henry David Thoreau has a segment on reading in Walden. In fact, the segment is entitled Reading, and he indicates that one of the real values of reading is that books can tell us what our friends and relatives can't tell us or won't tell us. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah,
Again,
I think for the most part.
books can tell us what our relatives and friends can't tell us or won't tell us.
Yeah, books will tell us a lot of the things that we don't want to hear, that are unpopular, like the truth. Our friends and relatives usually, before they'll come out with an absolute honest statement of some sort, are anticipating a good response, and they don't always tell you the real truth to the same degree that it exists. Whereas the books, you come across an author like Tolstoy, and he goes into the human character, human nature, to a degree that you recognize. You recognize many of your own feelings and experiences, and there's no holdback. He reveals it as it is.
You put it very well, holdback. I think all human beings, to varying degrees, are inhibited.
Sure.
That we can find it very difficult to confide to others some of our innermost thoughts. It's very human. So that very often when people get together and converse with each other, the conversation can tend to be superficial, that we're all wearing masks to varying degrees, playing. But when you read Tolstoy, you find out what the guy really is thinking. In fact, Tolstoy may even indicate to you, the character is saying one thing, and then the next paragraph, Tolstoy will tell you what he's really thinking, which is very human. And I find comfort, in a certain sense, in reading the great writers, because they make me feel less lonely, in the sense that I find that some of my innermost thoughts don't differ so much from the innermost thoughts of some other people.
Yeah, well, there's no question about it. I think one of the greatest learning experiences of youth is to realize, if they're exposed to good literature in the early part of their life in high school or something like that, that they're not the only ones that have those weird experiences, those weird, some might call perverted thoughts and so forth.
Yeah.
Hey, that's part of human nature. And I'm just, a regular person now that I know that the characters in these great books also experience the same thing. So I think it's a real growing experience as coming into a very complex life, to learn that, hey, I'm not really a freak. Other
You're
people have
putting
done the
it
same thing.
very well. I recall when I first started reading Freud, I think I was in my mid-20s, and after reading some of his works, in so many words, said, thank God, gee, I thought some of these thoughts I had were so weird. And he's telling me so many of these thoughts are very commonplace among human beings. Continuing again in this line of thought about what some famous thinkers have said about reading, Emerson, one of the great essayists of all time, said this, and I'm quoting Emerson, "In the highest civilization, the book is still the highest delight. Good books provide us with a resource against calamity. They are a source of entertainment, sympathy, and provocation."
You know, I think Emerson, if he was writing in the 20th to 21st century, would be even more forceful on good books, because today the competition for good books is much greater. During his time, it wasn't. But yeah, it's hard for me to believe an educated society without reading good books.
Yeah.
And it's you know, almost impossible to, I think, attain a degree of intelligence. Now, like I said, there are other experiences, and there's some good in television and other ways of gaining information. But the real depth, the profound existence of human nature is hardly ever reached except through a handful of great authors. Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Shakespeare is probably the greatest psychologist ever.
I agree with
you know,
that.
he gets down to the nature of man.
Yeah.
And you can't gain those insights and experiences without, you know, having authors like Shakespeare to refer to.
Shakespeare, among other things, shows us how complicated we are, that we tend, I think, if people don't read well or don't read good books, they may tend to simplify human nature. You've alluded to that very often. I think they may.
That's
they
always
may
the
do
case,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, said this, and this may surprise a lot of people since Muhammad was obviously a devoutly religious person. Muhammad said, "To spend more time in learning is better than spending more time in praying." He went on to say, "Acquire knowledge. It is our society in solitude, our companion when friendless. It guideth us to happiness. It sustaineth us in misery." And I especially like that line, "It is our society in solitude."
Yeah, that's a profound statement from a religious leader especially. You would think the emphasis would be more on prayer than learning. But yeah, I agree with that 100%.
I think one of the other nice things about having a passion for reading is that it allows people to enjoy their own company. I think that if one doesn't have any interest in reading, there's the temptation to be a social butterfly, to be on the telephone a lot, and for maybe much of the day, much of one's leisure time, or to turn on the television. And I think what you don't get from television, what you don't usually get from the internet, what we don't usually get from our friends and relatives, as well-meaning as they might be, is perspective on life. That I think the great writers help us to appreciate what's really important in life. I remember one of the best short books I ever read, which does this, was probably the shortest book Tolstoy ever wrote. We all know that Tolstoy's books tend to be 800, 900 pages, more than 1,000 in War and Peace. But he wrote a book called The Death of Ivan Ilyich.
Yeah.
I suspect you might have read that book.
Yeah.
And you might recall it's the story about a middle-aged man, a government bureaucrat who is dying, and he's reflecting on his life. And he feels that he never had perspective until now. He never saw his life in its totality, so to speak. That he comes to the conclusion he had the wrong values. He lived according to the wrong values. And when I read that book, I thought to myself, if one can get in the habit of reading good literature early on in life, it can help people to develop a more wholesome value system.
Yeah, I don't think you could really stand on your own 2 feet. And that's, if I had to criticize society today, that would be my main criticism, without having delved into and reflected upon the great authors. I think what we rely on today is the quick fix. Like, I know one of your favorite authors, Sinclair Lewis, in Babbitt. don't stand on your own 2 feet. Don't make your own decisions. Don't critically think about anything. If you want information, you turn to your favorite newspaper. They'll tell you, what way to think and vote in politics. You'll turn to your clergyman for your moral direction. You'll turn to your business group on how to expand your business, whatever society you belong to. But you don't make your own decisions because you're really not capable. You don't have the confidence in yourself to do it. And as a result, you rely on the so-called experts to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a superb point. I know in my own life, one of the results of reading for me, I like to think, is I am more self-reliant.
Yeah.
That I usually assume, and I don't mean this in a mean-spirited way, that the majority is wrong on almost any issue, that they're wrong. I used to believe when I was a kid that the majority is almost always right.
Yeah.
I think we all had the experience when we were kids. If we said something that the other kids thought was wrong, some kids might say, well, if we were to take a vote on that, you would see that you're the only one who thinks that way. And
You must be wrong.
Yeah, and we know if we read the great writers, and if we read a lot of history, we find out that so often the minority was right,
Yeah.
and so often the majority was wrong.
Yeah, I think Immanuel Kant said that the majority is always wrong.
Yeah.
Something that's strong, not that majority is always wrong.
Yeah, Thoreau pretty much said that also. He would very much agree with that. Again, we're talking about books and what some famous writers and other people have said about reading. My favorite quote, I think, concerning reading and its benefits comes from Harold Bloom, who teaches at Yale and NYU, as you probably know. He's an octogenarian who has written many books. My favorite book by him is The Western Canon, in which he expounds on which books he thinks are the greatest books ever written and which writers he thinks are the greatest writers. By the way, he believes Shakespeare is the greatest writer of all time. But he says this about reading, and I'm quoting Professor Bloom. He says, reading is the most healing of pleasures. Reading is the most healing of pleasures. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, just the fact that it's, you commented before also that it's a solitary thing. And I don't think you could heal as a group.
Yes.
We try it, but healing is a reflection on your life and your condition and plans for the future and so forth, which is done by yourself, basically, or with the help of the great authors through reading. And, I agree 100% that there'd be a lot less drug taking, smoking, and so forth if people fell back on, we don't have a natural instinct to read, but on the great thoughts of the great thinkers and writers of all time. And if they could reflect on them, there wouldn't be the need to escape this life as well. And you could heal some of the problems and troubles and complexes that you can't handle if you spent sufficient time reflecting on these.
I don't ever recall reading a good book whereby I didn't feel better afterwards, after reading for an hour or 2 hours, even when I read something sad. We know that Aristotle claimed that one of the advantages of tragedy, of watching a tragic play or reading a book that's portraying some kind of sadness, is that it can cause us to have a cathartic experience. Not to mention, it can help us to understand the world better. I find it strange, but true, that even when I read something sad, in a good book now, if it's presented well, that for some reason it has a healing effect on me. Also, I find that newspapers don't do it for me. Television doesn't do it for me. I read the New York Times every day, as I know you do occasionally. I read the Wall Street Journal, but usually the New York Times. And the big difference, I think, between even a good newspaper, and those are two good newspapers I mentioned, and a good book is the newspapers are dealing with the transient. The great books are dealing with the eternal. And the newspapers can't help to give us perspective. And I think that's one of the real advantages of them. I know some people are news junkies. Even I, at times, I think, tend to be a news junkie. I don't think that's good because, again, the newspapers and television can't give us that perspective which a really good book in literature or history can give us.
Yeah, and also bring you the joy that a good book can. In addition to that, most people don't associate joy as a result of reading. And, you know, very difficult to convince young students that there's a great deal of joy to come from reading a Shakespeare play or reading Tolstoy or reading Homer and others. But there's the kind of joy that you can't achieve elsewise. You can't consume a meal or have a relationship that'll bring you the same kind of joy as digging deeper than normally a movie or other experiences do, and revealing to you internally, reaching the self and saying, wow, that's a real experience that I had. And, you know, as I look back in life, I can remember some of the old TV shows that I first started to watch, some of the movies, old and new, but no experiences as moving and as permanent as things that I've read from Dostoevsky, from Sophocles, and others. Permanent experiences that you'll never lose.
Talking about joy, I'm so happy you used that word. You sound a little like Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci said that the noblest pleasure in life is the joy of understanding.
Yeah.
The noblest pleasure in life. That we can seek joy in a glass of wine, and there's nothing wrong with that. I sometimes do that. We can seek joy in the good feeling we get after physical exercise, and I know you, like myself, engage in daily physical exercise. And those are great embellishments to this life experience. But I think the highest joy, as far as I can tell, and I'm speaking personally now, is the joy of understanding it. When I read something and the lights go on, and I understand myself a little better, or people I love better, or people I don't even like, if I understand them better, or understand some of the more unsavory aspects of life better.
Yeah, well, you know, when you view life, particularly when you get a little older, and you're looking for some satisfaction, some deeper pleasures in life, you know, you've done the normal material things and it hasn't quite satisfied you completely. Life can be boring, can be a little miserable. Your hopes and frustrations are often not fulfilled. But a good book is not only a good escape mechanism, but it can more than just cause you to escape, it can cause you to grow. And I think this is the greatest advantage to experiencing some joyful thing that not only is pleasureful, but it gives you greater depth and breadth and meaning in life. And I think this is tremendously important. I know in my own case, when I have a good book, and I'm always into 2, 3, 4 books, and I choose them pretty carefully, I can't wait to get back to that book. Yeah. You know, if I'm having company, it gets a little boring and so forth, I'll try to find a way out of it so I can get back to that book, because I want to spend 3 or 4 hours getting into that next chapter and the next chapter.
This is one of the real joys of reading, I think, in that it always gives us something to look forward to. I always read before I go to bed, among other times during the day, but I always read in bed before I go to sleep. And if during the day I'm experiencing some difficulties, if I'm a little anxious or nervous, in the back of my mind I think to myself, oh gee, tonight I'm going to be reading that book. And that's a source of joy.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, for a while, you know, I was kind of reading into the classics that Harold Bloom and David Denby, you know, also wrote a book on the classics, and we try to read them. We get list of you provided me with a list of the 100 best books of the 20th century put out by the New York Library, and other lists as well. And you know, you get through most of those, and you feel that you might run out of good books.
Sure.
But if you're careful enough and read the bibliographies of the great authors and the great critics, and you know, you get more and more books coming on your list. And I keep a list. I got a pad that this author that I really respect refers to it, or Isaiah Berlin or George Steiner or somebody like that, said he was very influenced by I mean, I got a list. I'll never get through reading them, because there's always good books, and I have trouble choosing which one I want to get into next.
That is very interesting, because it's been said that since life is so short and so many good books have been written, that we have to be very selective in what we read. I think that's very important.
Oh, that's the most important thing, I think.
You mentioned a little while ago the word escape. And I think in some sense, reading is escapist, but in another sense, it's quite the opposite of it. Reading, I think, may be escapist in that we can tend to get away from our daily problems in reading a book. But by the same token, if you're reading great literature, great history, you are confronting head-on the nature of life. So in that particular sense, you're not escaping.
Yeah. See, like a movie might cause you to escape for an hour and a half, 2 hours. You know, you get involved with the movies, particularly the action movies and so forth. An hour and a half and 2 hours put into a book can cause you to escape the normal problems and solitude and so forth, but it also adds so much to your life that will go on for hours and years afterwards. The movie is saw and forgotten pretty much. The book, if digested properly in a good book, that will last you forever in providing satisfaction.
I find it amusing that today we refer to certain kinds of books as self-help books. Some psychologist, or maybe somebody who doesn't even know much about psychology, writes a book, probably just to make a lot of money, by the way. And when I think of self-help books, and we had a conversation about this off camera some time ago, and this is really your idea, but I agree with you, the self-help books are the classics. The self-help books are Crime and Punishment, War and Peace, Walden, Emerson's Essays, Hamlet, Macbeth. These are the self-help books. And I think that one of the values they have, in contrast to so much of what's coming off the presses today, is that they're much more sincere in confronting life. They're much more authentic, and they don't give easy answers, because there really are no easy answers to life's
Well, the
problems.
self-help authors try to give you easy answers. You want a solution to your weight problem, to your spiritual nature, all of these other things, read my book and it will solve your problem. But there aren't any. You got to get down deep.
The 7 Secrets to Successful Living. I think Tolstoy would probably laugh at the idea.
Of course. I think most of them are kind of worthless. Some of them might help some people with a particular problem or so forth. But like you said, I agree with you 100%. If you want to help yourself, you really want to help yourself, get to know yourself, get to know mankind, and you get this through the great
The only good self-help book I ever read, because I did read quite a few when I was younger, The Road Less Traveled. I've mentioned that to you.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
I highly recommend that to the viewers. The Road Less Traveled, written many years ago. We're running short on time. We're going to have to continue this discussion.
Sure. Anytime.
And I know we're going to continue this off camera. Finally, as usual, I'd like to end with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in Walden, his masterpiece, penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."